Good afternoon and most welcome to 821. And today on demand I will talk about The Ear of the Other, Autobiography, Transference and Translation by Monsieur Jacques Derrida, and this is from the year 1988. This is once more one of those fantastic deconstruction of a great philosopher, and in this case it's Friedrich Nietzsche. And we are talking about his autobiography, or we are talking about his autography. And here is in the real signature the confirmation of the text and its context. And its context to Nietzsche as an author or as a person, as an intender. And it's about his autobiography, especially in the first section, Ecce Homo. And this is relating to the act of self-production and connecting that to the larger structure of textuality, as Derrida often calls it. And what he does is unravels the paradox that an autobiography gains its authority as a text about the self, not through an act of self-signing, but through the reading, hearing of an other. The author's signature is entrusted to the other. And this is a quote from the book. Nietzsche's signature does not take place when he writes, but it will take place posthumously after his departure from this. Well, obviously it's Friday. It is when the other comes to sign with him, to join with him in alliance, and in order to do so, to hear and understand him. It is thus the ear of the other which signs, and the ear of the other which constitutes the autos of my autobiography. It is when something is heard by the ear, it becomes signed. And this is to compare what the eye does when you sign something. If you sign a leash, for instance, which I did recently, it's in the very signature of the leash. It's the visual that comes upon the signature that is the auto, the self that has sort of guaranteed something. It is you. And Derrida puts a brief focus on the deconstructive sense of self as is written and at once writing other, where the self is constituted in and through the other, at once given personal and political existence through this double action. Political existence is the signing, so to speak. You do something politically when you sign. It's a legal document. The ear is an organ for perceiving difference, and as such it is the listening ear which signs the contract through which the self and its message are constituted, interpreted politically and textuality. It is we then who honor the author's signature through the contract that is signaled by the differentiation of the ear. through the hearing of difference, through the reading which constitutes the identity of the self as a writing and written subject. So there's nothing less than a deconstructing of the self, and by there making, as always in the scheme of Derrida, making the self so much stronger. He, instead of connecting the autobiography to an original, one could say. This is the original writing of Nietzsche. This is an extremely weak link. That's the usual link we all have, but Derrida shows that this is an extremely weak link. It's barely a link at all. But what makes it a link is the seeing eye and the hearing ear and the perceiving hand and so forth in action. That's a strong link. One could also say that's money in the bank. But you can perceive the difference. If I go to a library and ask, is this really a book by Ian Fleming? 007 on New Adventures, I asked the librarian. The librarian can go do two ways. Either it can say, yes, I can prove to you this was written by Ian Fleming. It was his real hand and his real paper in 1962 at his office in southern London near the Thames. Instead, what the librarian should say, you are here, you see the book, I am witnessing you seeing the book. That is a strong connection. The other one, the proof of Ian Fleming writing something in 1961, that's the weak, that's, one could say, the original ideology. That an original, looking for an original would be a strong link to make something the real McCoy, to make something pure, real, true, originating from the very author. And it's critical in this context because you see the self as text. And in this complication, the problem of textuality in general comes up. And here Derrida take an approach going into biology, which is hearing, seeing, and the biographical. Which is the strongest link? And he's playing here on the division of biology into bio and logical, biological. And he indicates by there that the written nature of any life that we decide to know about, the biological self, is always at once both life, bios, and discourse, logos, both at the same time. You see, you perceive, you are there, you do something. That is what I would say a very strong link. Whereas the other, to repeat myself, would be such a weak link as not even to constitute a link. To look for an original made by someone in history without the presence of a biology, a body, it's extremely weak. I would say it's even a non-link. It is eradicating itself. It making its own position a lot weaker. It's a little bit like you becoming accused. You were accused of something and you saying, well, trust me, I wasn't there. I was on a journey to the island of Zealand in Denmark, and I was having dinner, and I was with my friend Agnes and Berta, both Danish, so forth. For every time you do that, you make the link so much weaker. Instead of using your whole biology and really being present, that proves your innocence. You see the point? Derrida is once more healing the text, and he's also healing our perception of what is autobiographical. And he does it with a gusto that is very self-sure. This is the later Derrida. I'm more used to reading the Derrida from the 60s. But here you have an even more self-assured Derrida. He shows clearly what is a strong link, what constitutes a relationship that you can actually trust. Well, you need biology to that. You need to be embodied somewhere, to use a term from Merleau-Ponty. He brings reality back into business. He makes reality hip. Well, you could say that. That's why Derrida is so cool. He brings everything into reality, and he's also revealing people not to be, I wouldn't even say it's a weak link, I would say that's a no link. To look for the original in that manner, as the original autobiography is weakening the case severely. It would never ever hold up in court. And if it doesn't even hold up in court, why would it hold up in real life? Why? It doesn't. So hence one could say that the so-called living subject of biological discourse is a part of the whole field of investment that includes the enormous philosophical, ideological and political tradition, with all the forces that are at work in that tradition, as well as everything that has its potential in the subjectivity of a biologist or a community of biologists. So you have bio, the living life, and you have discourse once more, the logos. But at the same time, the interpretation also goes both ways. There is constantly a connection between the signer of something and the one who sees it. That link is not severed, it's still there because of biology and instantation in reality. This is hefty stuff. It's an evaluation that influenced the meaning attached to the scholarly signature, but it also inscribed the biographical with the biological. Biographical being life signing, the signature is important, whereas the librarian in the first case would have ignored the very biological signature that is done by a hand, not automatically pressed from a printer or something similar. So listen carefully here, this is good. It is the living subject that is inseparable from the discourse of which he or she is part. Or to restate a post-structuralist cliché, life is always already a text. Well, of course, this textual processes is something that underpins all Derrida's analysis, whether they are from the 60s, 70s or the 80s, like this one, 88 I will remember. It underpins constantly the textual intercourse he is watching, and biology here does play a significant role. And of course, were I an analytical philosopher, I'd be horrified to bring biology into the scene, because usually when it comes to analytical philosophy, which actually pertains to all strands of knowledge in modern Sweden, doesn't matter if it's philosophy, sociology, anthropology, psychology, you name it, they are all similarly disembodied, not in reality. It will always be the case that biology is something horrendous. Bring in this fleshy thing of a body into life. Well, the body has always already been there, and it is always there. It's not something ephemeral or translucent or whatever you will have it. It is live and living, and is breathing. It has nerves, it has bones, it has all those things, and it does signature in reality, not somewhere else, not in a non-existent place. The signature is a sign for the writing self, but precisely as such it traverses the division between work and life, between the system and the subject of the system. This is also important. Similarly, the dynamics of the proper name is the most especially not a thin line between the enclosure of the philosopheme on the one hand and the life of an author already identifiable behind the name on the other. Here once more comes the other in. One of the features of this particular discussion on the signature is the thought of the eternal return, which Derrida takes from Nietzsche. Well, Nietzsche has this philosophy, this idea, I think I mentioned that to Kalle Lundahl a couple of months ago, eternal return, and that everything returns. It's a bit like Monday all week, or Groundhog Day, which is called actually in English, I remember now. Speaking of a recent celebration, everything returns, and this is a concept that Derrida really liked. He's very inspired by Nietzsche, and the concept relates to the function of the signature within the larger process and structure of writing, reading, to the iterability of sign, which Derrida discusses elsewhere. An act, signing the proper name, which seems singular and idiosyncratic, enters a structure where it exists in terms of multiple and repetitive actions. For every time you read a signature and communicate with the author, dead or alive, it does not matter in this case. So that there you have eternal return. It does not matter if the author is dead, you can still communicate with him, because the self doesn't stop with the thin layer of skin we has around us. That's another take. You can actually say that Derrida is deconstructing. He's discarding the idea that the thin layer of skin is the limit of the self. It's situated here and only here. He doesn't say it's situated somewhere else, but the actual limit is an unnecessary restraint of the self that does not match reality. Because if you sign something, that signature will persist in places you've never been, never would travel to, and it will actually persist way beyond your own death. So death and the dissolvement of skin is not the end, according to neither Nietzsche nor Derrida. And I think this deconstruction is at its very peak. So why fight the terminal idea of the human body when in a way it doesn't really exist as such? We all have eternal life in every aspect that matters. We might not have eternal life in aspects, but those very aspects do never ever matter. And that aspect is this looking for the original. Looking for the original in the first term, by the librarian example I put forward, is nothing. It doesn't help the case. It actually undermines the authority of the autobiography. It makes all links so much weaker than they could have been, and they show that that person in himself looking for the original, he lost the idea of eternal return or eternal life. He makes odd divisions that are subjective, only pertains to himself, and divisions that he or she cannot himself or herself understand. So it's a way of no understanding. So once again I have to repeat, Derrida is always helping the author and the reader. And he's putting me in a better position to understand Nietzsche, but he's also putting Nietzsche in a much better position of getting understood. Whereas all the others destroys that possibility by not understanding what it is to understand. I think this was so interesting, so I think I should I just have to mention that Rudolf Gachet wrote something about this as well, since I'm a recent fan of the fantastic Rudolf Gachet. So in one of these round tables discussion, Gachet wondered if Derrida's notion of text rather excludes any relation to the empirical at all. And I think that's a good question. Derrida responded predictably, perhaps. Questions the assumption underlying the question. The very formulation of such question is problematic, he argued, since the very value of empiricalness, or the very contours of an empirical text or any empirical entity, are themselves products of conventions and discourses. And nota bene, this is important when Derrida says that I think you understand by now, this is something that makes everything so much stronger. It's not a weakening saying those things, it's a strengthening. And that's is probably a help that Derrida or Rudolf Gachet wouldn't add, but I am adding that. That's my own conception, but this is not a far-fetched conception. I do believe it's a strengthening of the text always. It goes against the forces of weakening. And yeah, I wanted to add Paul de Man as well as here, but I won't do this lecture. I'll let that pass to the next lecture. I say thank you very much. We are having nightfall. The sun is setting slowly, and I wish you all a very pleasant night. Thank you very much.